Gerbiami ponai ir ponios, mes pradedam
Ladies and gentlemen, we are starting the second session. Which is part of the annual conference, the European Union and Global Trends, Political and Economic Changes. The part of the conference will be very interesting. We are speaking about political and economic changes and trends in the world.
dalis Europos komisijos priekybos.
And we would like to invite Signe Razzo from the Trade Strategy Analysis Division of DigiTrade and Anthony Gooch from OECD and Professor Dr. Stefan Kutz from the Forecasting Center in Kiel Institute. Since this conference is delivered in two languages, in two working languages, please get your earphones if you need translation from English. This conference is also being recorded on video and sound tape, and all the material will be streamlined and will be put on the website. The material will also be sent to all the participants via email. Now,
And thank you very much for attending. And we're happy to welcome you in Vilnius, our honorable guest who came for the first time in Vilnius, and hopefully not for the last. As Mr. Gooch told us that there will be a good news. He will share those news with us a little bit later. As far as we have a very tight time schedule, I would kindly ask speakers to keep track of time. And you see this huge clock on the wall. It's definitely for this purpose. So the time limit is 30 minutes per presentation, and I anticipate the audience will be flooding you with questions. Please save them for the panel session, for the discussion. And now I would like to give word for Professor Dr. Stefan Kutz from the Kiel Institute of the World Economy. And Dr. Kutz is a well-known economist, well-known by media. He is a bold speaker, straightforward speaker, and he's a head of Forecast Center, so I hope he will share us about the forecasts and his views on European Union economic outlook. Thank you very much, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you much for this very warm welcome and for the honor to speak here. It's a big pleasure to be here in your wonderful city. You mentioned it, I'm head of the Forecasting Center, but sometimes it's good to look back into history. Let me give you a few insights into where I'm coming from. The Kiel Institute for the World Economy was founded more than 100 years ago. Last year we celebrated our centenary. We were founded in February 1914, so just before the first tremendous disaster of the last century devastated so much of our well-being, our prosperity, our freedom even, to remind us that 100 years ago we already reached a degree of economic integration in terms of free flow of goods, of capital, even of people, that it took us more than 70 to 80 years to get back to this level of globalization. Sometimes we talk about globalization as if it was a new phenomenon. Actually, it is not. We are just coming back to where we already were, and there are still some fields of economic activity where we are still far away from what we already got 100 years ago. Just think of the fact that until 1914 we had a single global currency, and still today we are happy to have a European monetary union, but still kind of a regional currency, so far away from what we already had. Coming back to today's subject, I will talk about the European economic outlook, mainly focusing on the situation in the euro area, just for reasons of time restrictions. And I'd like to go with you through some fundamental messages. Well, good news, it's not really black and white, but there are well, relatively good news is that the European economy is on the verge of recovery. Yes, we see economic expansion, but it is still very moderate, and it remains very diverse among EU member countries. And the diversity is not between the former crisis or program countries on the one hand and the core countries on the other hand, but quite differently. What we see is some strong economic recovery in Ireland, in Spain and Portugal, and of course in the European tiger countries, so in the Baltic countries. And we are very concerned about very sluggish developments in France and Italy, and of course about Greece, which is a very special case. And this should remind us that just looking at European averages is a little bit too simplistic. Having a situation with a still deep recession in some parts of the European economy, and having other parts that are near to overheating. We're not saying that they are already overheating, but all the circumstances that we can observe today make it kind of very likely that, for example, the German economy is on the road to overheating, not in this year, but in next years and the following years. And this is not good news. Sometimes you hear this talk about we need a business cycle locomotive, and it's nice if one part of the euro area is growing very rapidly so it can pull with it all the other countries. But this is very naive thinking. Actually, having one part of the European economy in an overheating mode is bad news, because what we want is economic stabilization all over the euro area, or not just having an average that looks like, right? And very often people are frustrated about the sluggish development that we are seeing in the last 4 or 5 years in the post-crisis period. This does not come as a surprise, actually. This is the normal pattern that we can observe after a financial crisis. And to understand better why it is a normal pattern, we should realize what a financial crisis actually is. It is not something that comes out of the blue, which takes part in the financial sector only, and which is then hampering economic development in the so-called real economy. This is not the case. The financial crisis is just the flip side of capital stock distortion, a huge capital stock distortion, which is deeply rooted in the production structures of the real economy. And one cannot understand what's going on during a financial crisis without looking at what has led to this financial crisis, what were the driving forces in the run-up to this crisis. As the word already says, a crisis is already the beginning of, well, deep restructuring. And therefore, I would like to raise your awareness that in the run-up to this financial and debt crisis that we are undergoing in the European economy, there's an overexpansion of credit, which is rooted in excessive money creation. The money supply in the Euro area doubled within 9 years, the first 9 years. It doubled, right? So we had on average 2 low interest rates that triggered lots of credit creation out of thin air, and this fed into real estate bubbles mainly, but more generally it led to investment that was not sustainable. We should never forget that a financial asset or financial claims are just the flip side of some investment that is going on. And once it becomes clear that the investments in the real economy will never produce the yields that one initially expected, a financial crisis happens. If this is of a systemic nature, you will see malinvestments each and every day going on in each and every economy without leading to a financial crisis. But if you are systematically inducing people to overinvestment or to wrong investments due to a too expansionary monetary stance, then this becomes a financial crisis, because it's not only an individual investor that sees his expected returns not materializing, but you see this on a very broad range of investment projects, and then you see a financial crisis, which is just reflecting that the production structure, the production possibilities do not match what consumers in the markets actually want. So this is a mismatch within the real economy, and now we have to restructure it, and this is a very burdensome process. Think of the example of Spain. In the boom of Spain, 25% of the male workforce were working in the construction sector, which gives you an idea of how distorted the production structures in these economies were. And now it becomes clear to everyone that just continuing with even more construction only to keep these people employed is economic nonsense. So you have to restructure your whole production system. And you cannot make a healthcare worker or a computer scientist out of a construction worker overnight. This takes time. And therefore, the best policy to prevent these very harmful restructuring processes is to prevent a new distortion of a capital stock to come into existence. I will come back to this at the end of my presentation, when I will try to very briefly hint at some risks that we currently see stemming from the very expansionary monetary policy stance of the European Central Bank. At the same time, we see very low rates of inflation, and we had a very vivid debate. Is there a deflation risk in the European economy? Is there even a deflationist spiral which makes things even worse? And the way we see it is no, there's no risk of deflation whatsoever. Yes, inflation is below the medium-term target of the ECB, but this is a medium-term target. Lower oil prices that translate themselves in lower consumer prices are good news for this economy. It is strengthening economic activity, and part of the restructuring by its very nature is also lowering the price level. What goes on if lots of capital flows into countries like Spain or Portugal or Ireland in the run-up to the crisis? Well, it means that you have huge injections of purchasing power there. It's just what is the very being of capital flows. And this drives prices and wages up. Once these capital flows stop, for very good reasons, of course, all these price and wage levels must adjust. And on average, this looks like deflation, but it's just a restructuring of the real economy. And we cannot prevent all the side effects from happening. Take a Mercedes-Benz dealership in Athens. Of course, he is not at the heart of the financial crisis, but the fact that a significant amount of consumption in Greece was only possible due to the capital inflows, most of them channeled through the government sectors, means that fewer Mercedes cars will be sold in the near future in Athens, which means we need fewer dealerships. So these kind of second round effects are unavoidable. If we try now with economic policy instruments, monetary policy, fiscal policy, to prevent all these side effects, then we will also hinder the necessary restructuring of this economy. This is a sad news for the countries, but it is unavoidable. What we are seeing is that the labor market conditions are improving from very depressed levels, that is true, but for more than 4 quarters now we see an improvement, in particular in some of the crisis countries like Spain, like Portugal, like Ireland. Even in Greece we saw some progress over the last quarters, but this process came to a sudden stop. As does fiscal consolidation. Yes, we will see the government balances to improve even next year, but this improvement has nothing to do with consolidation efforts. Consolidation means to improve the structural fiscal balance. And all the improvements of the actual fiscal balance have 2 causes. One is the better business cycle environment. It's nothing to do with structural efforts whatsoever. And the second is only seemingly linked to structural improvements, which is a lower interest burden, even for the highly indebted countries. We account this as being part of the structural balance, the interest burden, but it is obvious that we have an artificially low level of interest payments of all European economies. So we must be very careful not to misinterpret the fiscal progress that is done, because this is due only to interventions from the European Central Bank. It has nothing to do with the core field of fiscal policy making. I already mentioned the situation in Greece. Maybe if you have some time, we can come back on this later. But I'm not sure whether I can really call this good news, but the facts seem to be that even a total collapse in Greece, which no one can wish, of course, will not massively affect the rest of the euro area. Not via the trade channel, of course, because Greece is just a too small economy, but even not on their financial channels, because most of the Greek debt is now in the hands of other governments or European institutions. But we should be very, very cautious not to get into the trap of the run-up to the next capital stock distortion and the next financial crisis. What we are observing today is a situation of low interest rates, not only in the European economy, but more or less on a global scale, at least in the Western economies, in Japan, in the UK, in the United States, of ultra-low interest rates. And this is extremely dangerous. The longer the low interest rate regimes continue, the more the production structures and also financial claims adapt to this extremely low interest rate environment. Interest is part of each and every good price, of each and every other factor price. So if you have a low interest rate for a couple of quarters, this is not a big problem. But the longer this period continues, the larger the part of the economy that is oriented, that can only work as long as interest rates remain low. And they are not low because we have excessive savings. They are so low because we have central banks all over the world that are pumping tremendous amounts of liquidity into the markets, right? So this is an artificial interest rate. This does not come out of the free market, and this makes the situation so fragile. The exit strategy becomes more and more difficult the longer we wait, and at the same time, all the negative side effects become more and more difficult. Think of the big pension funds. Think of the insurance, the life insurance industry, or even think of healthy manufacturing companies, which come under more and more pressure because all their pension systems cannot cope with practically zero real interest rates, right? They are more or less limited to invest in AAA financial assets only. And there is no yield in AAA assets for a sustained period of time. And this puts even the healthy part of our economies into very different circumstances. Therefore, yes, the fact that we are undergoing a fundamental restructuring process is a process that is frustratingly slow, and therefore it becomes more and more tempting to stimulate this process by even more support from the monetary authorities or fiscal programs, new deficit spending. But believe me, fighting the results of a debt crisis by accumulating even more debt is not a good idea. And the Juncker initiative was already mentioned. We should be very cautious not to misuse the European level in the sense that we are investing only because we want to stimulate aggregate demand as fast as possible. If there are investment opportunities that only the European level can address, then this is fine. But if you look at all the initiatives that were, well, sent to the Commission, most of them are more or less ridiculous. They have no European dimension whatsoever. So there's only the idea, well, we want to stimulate our economy. If there's easy financing for doing so, let's get this money and pump it into our economy. But what we need is, as we have a problem with our capital stock, we should be very cautious not to invest something, but to guide our savings to the right investments. Why do we have the downward pressure on wages in the crisis countries? Because the per capita capital stock that is marketable is one of the major factors for labor productivity, and labor productivity is what determines the wage level. And as tremendous parts of our capital stock are no longer marketable, we must be extremely cautious not to invest somewhere, but to direct our scarce savings to the right projects. And we must be very sensitive not to say that investment is per se good. This is not the case. Investment is only good and has only economic value if it leads to an increase of current or future consumption possibilities. Only if at the very end of a production process there is a marketable consumption good or public consumption, reasonable public consumption, then you have created economic value. Drilling down holes in the soil and that nobody cares for is not creating income. We should never forget that. Liquidity transfers are not the same as production, and production must always be oriented towards current or future consumption. Everything else is economically without value. I'm tempted to say something on the macroeconomic imbalance procedure. Let me keep this very, very short. here, this kind of is linked to what was already discussed under the umbrella of subsidiarity. The macroeconomic imbalance procedure was developed to prevent a new financial crisis to develop. And as we observe it, we see it more and more transformed into a mechanism of more and more economic policy coordination. And we are not convinced, to say the least, that the financial crisis was due to a lack of policy coordination. It was rather due to the causes that I briefly described at the beginning of my presentation. And what we see is even a more and more integration, more and more surveillance to prevent governments from doing mistakes or doing wrong policies. Well, it's not so easy to say what are good and what are bad economic policies. Actually, there is no consensus within the European Union what good and bad economic policies are. This is the reason why the theoretic underpinnings of the MIP is extremely weak. It's open towards all directions. You can subsume everything under this umbrella. But how can you tell the European Commission, please make sure that there are no new macroeconomic imbalances arising within the European member countries, without telling this Commission, at the end a bureaucracy, what macroeconomic imbalances are that they should care for. There's no viable definition of a macroeconomic imbalance. Just think of the current account balance, highly controversial. And this is only one of the many examples that one could give here. And it belongs to the principle of subsidiarity that as long as responsibility and policy action remains in the same hands, that you must have the right to commit errors, even political, economic policy errors. This is part of our constitutional concepts. This is part of the diversity. Otherwise, we would stop learning from each other. Yeah? If everything is checked, if you have no latitude whatsoever on the national level, then we would get into serious conflicts within our European community. Plus, it would weaken the whole mechanism as an early warning system. This is why we have established it in the first place. And all the experience that we have with supranational surveillance architectures from the IMF or other institutions tells us that whenever there is a surveillance mechanism overfreighted with all kinds of policy targets, then the initial idea why this was once implemented is fading away. Okay, very quickly, some more quantitative forecasts for the European economy. What we are currently seeing, observing, is economic activity is slightly gaining momentum. We are expecting, well, some 1.3% this year and maybe a little bit more next year. The potential output estimations, which are a highly problematic concept, by the way, tells us that the potential production, so the increase of production within the European economy that would not imply a change in capacity utilization, is currently as low as 0.6%, so extremely low from an international perspective, but also from an historical perspective. But there are signs of increasing capacity utilization, news that come in from production, from order inflows, from sales volumes are all going upwards. The Euroframe indicator is indicating a higher degree of higher economic activity. There is disinflation, but not deflation. If we look at the core rate, which is not prone to misinterpretations from oil prices or food prices, we are below the target, the medium-term target, but it is, again, a medium-term target, not a target to address each and every quarter. And therefore, we should see the current situation from the inflation side as something that is supporting economic recovery in the European economy and not threatening it. The labor market is improving, and our forecasts tell us, that the overall level of activity is increasing, but the picture remains diverse. I mentioned this in my introductory remarks. It is mainly dominated by domestic factors. In particular, the Germans this year are consuming as crazy. We are expecting the highest growth rate of consumption spending since reunification. This is a temporary effect. It will fade out, but nevertheless, it's stimulating currently the German economy, and we see similar pictures in other countries. Fiscal policy remains neutral, will even be expansionary next year. And exports are also accelerating. And the only reason why net exports do not absorb even more of the increase in production is because the domestic factors are so strong that imports are also increasing. Inflation will pick up, remain below the target, but nothing that we think is alarming. There are several factors already working against lower inflation, which is the depreciation of the euro. Obviously something that the European Central Bank is actively achieving at to kick capital out of the euro area, thereby depreciating the currency and stimulating exports. But let me also say, having a weak currency is not the ultimate goal of economic policy making. There is not a single example in the world economy, in the history of world economy, where a country would get extra well-being out of a weak currency. The efficiency of an economy mainly depends on having a strong currency which gives clear allocation signals to all participants in the marketplace, and having it artificially manipulated by the central bank is temporarily alleviating the situation for the export industry, but the export industry is not the same as the economy, right? So we must be very cautious not to follow the particularistic interests of some groups. We should look at what is in the interest of the whole economy. And the very reason why we are undergoing economic activity is for the consumer and for no one else. And the consumer clearly is not better off if he can buy less for his income. Plus, the oil price will, of course, also recover. Capacity utilization increases. So there are good reasons to assume that inflation will pick up. For those of you who are interested in the details, as we are distributing all these slides, I will just skip this and leave also the rest of my presentation to the debate. Main message, again, we must be very cautious not to believe that by low interest rates guaranteed by the central bank, by even more liquidity injections, we could get out of the mess. A central bank can print money. It cannot print capital. And capital is what you need to increase labor productivity, and only if labor productivity is increased, you can increase wages and well-being of the broader population. So much from my side, and I'm highly interested in a vivid debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for staying within your time frames. And now from growth, you showed us so many different aspects of growth, and now we will try to turn to measuring growth. And Mr. Anthony Gooch, he's actually responsible for retuning OECD brand name towards better life through the better. Anthony, how do you call it? Better life through
life index.
Yeah, better life index, sure. And I hope that you will show us the different aspects of measuring their better life, and better policy through better policies to better life. Now you will present us the OECD point of view on the well-being, and hopefully we will see also some of Lithuanian indicators too, despite we are not in the list of OECD formally at the moment.
Well, yeah, Katerina, thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure for me to be here today. It's my first time in Lithuania. It's overdue, and I'd like to thank Laima, who saw me in action in Brussels a few months ago in a conference organized by DG ECFIN in Brussels, Economic and Finance Directorate, looking at origins of the crisis and how you worked through them. I'm also delighted to share a panel with a former colleague, Signe, DG Trade, but also a former colleague in the OECD, and with Stefan, because I've been working very closely with Dennis Snower at the Institute and colleagues for the last 4 or 5 years. Unfortunately, I have never managed to go to your exotic conferences in Istanbul, Rio. I've always gone to Kiel, but it's been very nice going to Kiel and much appreciated. I'm going to, I think, juxtapose my presentation a little bit with what you've heard from Stefan, because I think that there are different ways, and we think that there are different ways that we need to look at what is in front of us now in the crisis context and because of the crisis, but also prior to the crisis. What is it that we are actually discussing today and why? So we're talking about global trends, economic and political. They are eminently societal. Does it mean that the consumer is the ultimate beneficiary of everything? Do we reduce ourselves down simply and purely to consumers? So I will argue today that we have an obligation as policymakers to go well beyond that, just as we have to go well beyond GDP. Now, the OECD that you know, and I hope you can actually see this, you're very familiar, I hope, with this manifestation of the OECD. And I'm going to say a few remarks that speak to this traditional way that we have looked at the global economy and continue to look at it, and then I'm going to juxtapose it a little bit with how we are seeing things more broadly. And here I can compliment Stefan a little bit, because we produce economic outlooks twice a year, and we produce forecasts for the global economy, which is a challenging thing. The only others to do this are the IMF, and we both get it wrong. The crisis has shown this. It's the degree to which we get it wrong that we are concerned by, but we know that we're going to get it wrong, because inherently economic forecasting is based on models that do not respond to human behavior and activity. That is also an issue that we need to look into. We, on this dimension and measure, are looking at a more optimistic scenario for the global economy moving into 2015 and 2016. We're predicting that growth for 70% of the world's GDP, that is the G7, the Euro area, China, India, and Brazil, will be in the region of 4% in 2015 and rising to 4.3% in 2016. But the lion's share of that growth is actually coming from China, India, and the United States. The Eurozone, we see the Euro area, we see growing 1.4% in 15 and 2% in 16. And compared to what we said was going to happen in November, because now we're doing this all the time, how far were we off in November? It's an increase in 0.3%. So we'd rather have come in lower and it's going to be better. We tended to come in too high. Economic forecasters tended inherently to be pre-programmed to forecast above what was actually going to happen. And in the crisis context, we believe that that is something we need to be careful of. Why? Stefan's gone into a number of the issues in terms of why we see these trends for 15-16. The drop in the oil price. Let's remember that the price of oil, the barrel, has gone down by 50% since January 2014. Central banks have eased monetary policy, and this has impacted 50% of the world's GDP. The ECB's measures are having an effect on interest rate projections and exchange rate depreciation, as Stefan commented. There's been a 14% depreciation in the euro since January 2014, and actually 10% of that, so 10% depreciation only since December of last year. Unemployment picking up a little bit as well. In the G7 countries, we see unemployment coming down to 6%. It was around 5.5% prior to the onset of the global crisis in 2007. In the case of the European Union, there are a number of issues that we are focusing on. Perhaps I might digress a little bit there from what Stefan said about imbalances. Perhaps from an OECD perspective and a global perspective, we find it we're a bit more adventurous in looking at the imbalances, whether they are within the Eurozone or whether they are global. And what Stefan said regarding pensions is really interesting. And investment, because we look at investment now and probably think that there's been overinvestment in certain parts of the world like China and underinvestment in the West. And all of these issues are interconnected, and we're going to have to address them. To hear that Germans are going out there and buying like there's no tomorrow is perhaps a positive thing. That wasn't happening before. And in terms of providing some balance within the Eurozone, that may be a little bit overdue, just as it is important for partners within the Eurozone to continue on a trajectory that they have started of serious structural reforms. In some cases they have been accelerated, and in some cases they have taken a little while and continue to take a little while. Investment is going to be pretty critical in this whole story. And this is going to take me a little bit now into a slightly different way of looking at the world. But we're well placed to do it at the OECD. Why? Because if we did become obsessed with GDP, in great part it's we have to hold our hand up, not to say that we propagated it, but we were very involved as an organization right back from the OEEC in the 1940s in bringing GDP as a critical measure. But GDP is not designed to measure well-being. It has become a measure of success, and it's unfair on GDP. And I would commend a book by Diane Coyle, A Brief but Affectionate History of GDP, because GDP has been given a bum rap. It's been asked to do too many things, and it can't do those things. So what might be able to do some of those things as we move forward. And part of what I'm going to put to you is that we need to look a little bit at the meaning of life. I'm not talking about a film by Monty Python, although if you have seen it and it's made you smile, I hope some of what I say will make you smile as well. But I'm not pulling this rabbit out of a hat. But there's been a crisis, we have to fundamentally change. Just look back at the historic document that set the OECD up in 1960. If it didn't exist, we'd have to invent it. Because we were set up to improve the economic and social well-being of our peoples. And that's eminently societal. How do you go about doing that? Well, Back in 1970, and it's interesting because this is not a new consideration or concern, it's been a concern of humanity since time immemorial, but we produced a handbook on the quality of life and social indicator programs back in the 1970s. And at that time, we were looking at identifying social concerns of sufficient common interest to the governments of the OECD countries. And a lot of this work was concluded in 1973, a period of another oil turbulent time. So you're seeing that this isn't a new fad. This is something that has been with us for a little while. But it's brought into sharper focus by the crisis. And I'm going to show you a couple of things of how the global agenda transforms and how we very quickly fall into the trap of thinking this has always been this way. Who was the man of the year in 2007? Any guesses? Time magazine. Have a guess. There you go. How many of you know who the man of the year is this year? Shout. The Pope. Not just any Pope, but a Pope who's put issues like inequality at the top of the international agenda. What was the front cover of The Economist magazine? Okay, a bit more hardcore now. Okay, a bit less wishy-washy. Adam Smith. On top of the world, Goldman Sachs culture of risk, abseiling off cliffs, anything is possible. Now what? The new politics of capitalism and inequality. The Economist worried about inequality, I say. How the world changes. What's happened is that the international agenda has significantly transformed in the last 6 years. And to blow our own trumpet, which is part of what my job is, I'll say we've had a little bit of a role in that because we're a very serious organization and what we do and what we say is taken reasonably seriously. So back in, what are the issues, if you like, that now we're very used to seeing top of mind for policymakers? Inequality. Inequality was nowhere in 2007 in the OECD and in OECD countries. Countries like Mexico, a number of members of the organization had issues around it. But was this top of policymakers' minds? And now you've got the IMF and Davos making it their top issue for 2015. That's always on the top of policymakers' minds, but unemployment levels, the like of which we haven't seen for decades. Middle classes suffering. And this is very critical when we're looking at policy making as well, because some of the most important determinants of our democracies and policy making fields are the responses of middle classes. In democracies, they pay tax, they look for public services, and this is very much what our world is made of. If the middle classes aren't doing well, that's a pretty worrying signal. And a total collapse in trust. Now, is it a collapse or is it that we just didn't really have it, but we didn't worry about it when everything was going well, when the music was playing, and proverbially we had very little to worry about during those early noughties. When I talk trust, I'm talking trust in government, in corporations, public institutions, in anything you can think of. So all of that brings about what is considered to be system failure. The systems that we have been operating under, they are not working. You also have to wonder the degree to which systems focused purely and simply around consumption work, particularly when you have in mind major challenges like climate change and the link between consumption and existing consumption and climate change. A clock ticking 2 degrees, 4 degrees, 6 degrees. I've just been in Paris, where for the second time in 2 years, you are not able to drive your car on a given day. Half of the cars of Paris are stopped from driving because of pollution levels. And forget what they're living in the Philippines, where every single day you have thousands of people struck by all sorts of horrible events. Now, let me tell you a little bit of a story in terms of how we got here. Because these issues, they haven't always been on the top of the OECD agenda. They've become very important for us and they've become very important on the global agenda. And I think it's useful for you to know also that much of the work that underpins what we've done now, and where I'll tell you also that many other institutions are very involved in this, institutions such as the European Commission, who've been accompanying our work and taking their own work forward, and many other countries. We organized a group for the first time to measure the progress of societies. So having done GDP, okay, what can we produce to actually go beyond it? And that began in 2004. Note it's 2004, that's prior to the crisis, and we set ourselves out clearly in 2007, again we didn't have a crystal ball, to look at the key indicators, health, education, environment and many others, that need to go alongside employment, productivity, purchasing power, etc. So it's not a rejection of something, but is that enough? Do we reduce it down? And that's in 2007, before the crisis hits. Prescient, I joined OECD in 2008. The OECD comes out with its first report diagnosing inequality within OECD countries. We're not talking here about the work that the World Bank does when it's looking at between rich and poor countries. We're looking at what happens within our societies, societies that are democracies, that have been working with market economy systems in many cases for decades, that have had social welfare systems for decades, in some cases that invented them. And we see how the gap between the rich and the poor in a number of OECD countries, notably the United Kingdom, notably the United States, some of those that you would say have the best comparative advantages, those gaps have been widening. 1 year later, the Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi Commission comes out with new measures on well-being. This is the Commission on the Measurement of Economic Performance and Social Progress. So joining up these two elements, and the aim was to identify the limits of GDP as an indicator of economic performance and social progress, and to consider additional information required for the production of a more relevant picture, to discuss how to present this information in the most appropriate way and check the feasibility of measurement tools that were proposed by the Commission. It included representatives from the French statistical offices, from the OECD, from the European Commission, and countries such as the US, France, the United Kingdom, and India. And it was made public September 2009. President Sarkozy of the time took quite an interest in this. So we're seeing here one number cannot summarize everything. We're getting the confirmation, if you like, that this clarity of purpose around the fact that we need to go beyond GDP. But it's easy to say, then how about doing something like that? This is paradigm shifts. This is big stuff. So you're seeing efforts being taken forward. This is an example of academics in Stanford University. But just look at the left and right hands, and what you're able to see there is the GDP measure per capita and a well-being measure. They don't correlate. They don't correlate? They don't correlate. And particularly when you look over time, they correlate even less. You can take snapshots that show correlation, but when you look over time, what you find is that the divergences between GDP performance and well-being performance, they start diverging. And they certainly don't correlate inherently. A number of national measures are taken as well. So this isn't the OECD in its corner. This is a whole host of countries, members of the European Union who I've listed here, and the European Commission itself in 2007, who are taking this extremely seriously. The social state of the Netherlands in 2001, growth, well-being and quality of life, the Enquête Commission in the Bundestag in 2010, the Italian groups on steering the measurement of progress in Italian society. The United States is also involved in this since 2007, and the United Kingdom. The Commission began its project in 2007 with the Parliament, the Club of Rome, the OECD and the WWF, with a high-level conference going beyond GDP. So you're seeing that a whole host of policymakers are really taking this issue seriously. Ekaterina was mentioning an initiative that we developed at the OECD, which was also designed to actually make this a lot more better known. So what I've talked to you about so far is really expert level, but it hadn't really percolated heavily into the public domain, although Chris Giles, who's the economics editor of the Financial Times, putting this initiative on the front page of the FT's website for 48 hours meant that we thought we were getting something right, just as, again, The Economist is an interesting bellwether. The Economist did produce a snapshot measure of GDP and the index, and felt that they had found correlation, but there are many holes to pick into those arguments because it depends very much on what you consider to be most important in terms of your well-being. That's part of the processes that we're in now. We fast forward into 2011. We've done one report on inequality in 2008. We're coming up with the next report in 2011, and unfortunately, what we're seeing is that things are actually getting worse. Why? Because our data, which always has a slight time lag, official sources, we're now entering into that crisis period that began in 08, and we're actually starting to seeing that with the crisis, inequalities are growing. Normally, rich people do very well in crises. They have liquidity and they're able to bring that to bear. Poorer people tend to do less well, and we know when cuts happen, they often sometimes disproportionately impact on less well-off parts of the population. We're also looking at what lessons we learn as part of the crisis. I was talking about economic forecasting. That was one of the first things that we started dwelling on, which was what are the elements that underpin the reason why we were getting our forecasting wrong and highballing rather than lowballing, and what could we do about improving it in the future. And we've started to incorporate these lessons, but also putting well-being at the center, as it was back in 1960, at the center of the purpose, what it is that we're actually trying to achieve. And just recently, we had the latest research coming out in 2014, which hit the front page of Le Monde in no uncertain terms and around the world. Okay, I want to now juxtapose a little bit, because the story I've just told you there's a parallel story going on, which is about who we work for as an organization. I'd say that's a pretty pyramidal, hierarchical structure, which many in policy making have been involved in for some time, where you were seeing the government, if you like, at the top of that pyramid, and then everything cascading down from that. That was certainly, I'd say, something that characterized the OECD, even when I joined in 2008. I think what we're seeing today is a world in which we're actually placing citizens at the center. Citizens do consume. They also vote, they pay tax, they do many other things. They breathe air, they have friends, they're human beings, and they interact in that way. So what are we doing for them? But the organization, the OECD, is also growing, and this is also where Ekaterina was mentioning earlier. We're growing in terms of our own impact and influence. It's set up as an organization that's designed to have global influence. We're not universal, which I'd say is a real advantage in today's day and age. Most universal entities, unfortunately, are not making great progress. Just look at UNFCCC, cross our fingers for Paris at the end of the year. The World Trade Organization, not quite universal, but 150 countries, and I spent a lot of time in trade negotiations before. Unfortunately, there hasn't been a lot of success in some of these areas. So the recipe that we've got here is a really interesting one. Firstly, you'd be quite surprised perhaps to find out that Mexico, Turkey, and Australia are all founding members of this organization. So when you're thinking about club of rich countries, I don't think Mexico would then or today have considered itself to fall into that category, or indeed Turkey. This is a more normal picture for you, where you're looking at North America and the European Union members, but there are actually many members of the OECD who aren't EU members, who are in EEA, and there are some members who are in the EU and not yet in the OECD. This changed in 2010. We had 4 countries join. It's the first time that we'd had countries join for about 10, 12 years, and we saw Israel, Chile, Estonia, and Slovenia come in. We are in discussions with Colombia, Latvia, and with Russia. We were in discussions. They are currently on hold. We put them on hold prior to the referendum in Crimea because of the situation there, and that is the situation as it stands now. We're also now in the business of exploring which other countries could begin this process of membership of OECD, and they include Lithuania and Costa Rica. And whilst I can't give you privileged information today, I would say keep your eyes peeled to June, to our annual meeting, where the members of the organization are due to take a decision on whether or not to open that process. But in any event, Lithuania is extremely well positioned and well placed to do so, through its EU membership, but also through the work it's done in many fields. And you may also believe that the current geopolitical context may play into that positively as well. Then you start seeing even more colour appear in this map. That's because of the influence that the organization has through the standards that are developed. Secondary education, the PISA standards, I hope you've all heard of them. There are now 80 countries in the world who are party to it. China, Brazil, India, all sorts of countries. So this has now become a global standard. Interestingly, the areas where we have some of the most important global standards are not areas of strong EU competence. Education and tax among them. We also work very closely with others. And when I say others, we work very closely with entities in different walks of life. Other international organizations, they're key for us. NGOs are very, very important in the work of the OECD, actually, in terms of pushing and cajoling, because much of what we do is peer pressure, ranking, and that peer pressure then affects quite significant change. Okay, but I've told you that in part because you need to understand where we're going as an organization and who we're looking to be responsive to. Because if we want to be responsive to citizens a little bit more, then we've got this question of the meaning of life. One of the first things we need to do is we need to ask the question. We're going to do it on a certain basis. You need to frame a question in a certain way, and this is the OECD. We're a relatively serious organization, as you know, been around for over 50 years. But we've come up since the early 2000s with a framework which, among others, was also verified by the Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi Commission, where we see individual well-being with components that are quality of life objectives that are to be juxtaposed with material living conditions. And those material living conditions are not at all to be rejected, but we need to keep them in context. The material living conditions is a very important element. The way we measure is not by individual, per capita. We don't live per capita. We live in homes, households. That's how we live as human beings. We do not live per capita. We must not forget the fact that we also have to deal with some GDP regrettables. What does that mean? That means we need prisons, we need armies, we need to recover from natural disasters. These are all things that happen. We would rather they didn't, but they do, and we have to be prepared for them as societies. We're also obviously interested in sustainability over time. You can't quite see it. It's different types of capital. I like to talk about capitalisms rather than capitalism, because you're looking at human, social, natural, many types of capital that we now have to worry about, and we've had to worry about for a little while. Okay, so the focus shifts from inputs and outputs to outcomes. What are, the figures that we were giving you earlier on, what's this actually going to deliver? We're looking both at averages and inequalities, because we now care about inequalities. How is stuff getting distributed? As for many years, we said, globalization, fantastic, trickle down, everybody benefits. Certainly, take a country like Brazil, things have done, and many people have done extremely well. You take other countries, and that's not necessarily always the case, so we have to put this top of mind. We're looking also at projecting over time, medium and long term, and putting people, rather than the economic system or GDP itself, at the center of the concerns. So now to the index, which is designed to try and achieve this a little bit. The first thing it does is use that framework and say, you tell me what you think. You tell the OECD what you think. You actually have to make choices. You have the 11 dimensions, so 8 on quality of life, sense of community, education, environment, civic engagement, health, life satisfaction, safety, work-life balance. I personally don't consider them to be exhaustive. It so happens that we have measures for all of them, so that's part of the reason that we also did come up with them. But there are flagrant things missing for me in quality of life, like culture, sport, climate, and elements of that nature. When I say climate, I mean, if you're living in a sunny climate, because we talk about the periphery of the Eurozone and the core. What's the core of the Eurozone in July, August, and September? Greece. The periphery is Northern Europe. You get away. So interesting transfers happen at those times as well. What we offer is an opportunity for people to be able to talk to us and give us what their preferences are, first off, because we have to ask that question, what is most important to you? And countries are ranked according to the data that we have, which is objective in most cases, except for subjective data on life satisfaction. That's the closest we have to happiness there. This isn't a happiness index, it's a well-being quality of life index, and that is subjective. And we have to start capturing subjective data. It's not enough to have objective data. Self-reported data is included in there as well, for example, in the field of health. So, by way of example, if you give 5 out of 5 to life satisfaction, a big petal blows up, one of the 11 petals of the flower of life, and I don't know when this snapshot was taken, but at that point, Switzerland was doing extremely well in terms of life satisfaction. That was a feeling of Swiss in terms of the data we had. That data we take from Gallup, who we've been working with for many years. But perhaps more interestingly over time for policymakers is what people are actually telling us. Not what the data that exists now, which is probably incomplete and needs to be far more buttressed in future because we need to start measuring differently, but what matters to people around the world. So we have a site that we went live with a few months ago, which is updated in real time, and where you're able to see how people rank those 11 dimensions. Unfortunately, in the case of Lithuania, only 128 people had actually completed the index and shared it with us a week ago. So if I can invite this audience to do something about that, I would be very happy indeed, because we need a little bit more data from you. It's not available in Lithuanian. It's available in 6 languages: in English, French, Spanish, Russian, German, and Portuguese, and soon in Italian. What are we seeing in terms of participation? Very interesting. So far, we've had almost 6 million visitors worldwide to the index, and we're pushing 100,000 indexes shared. Initially, we didn't press enough for people to share their index. We did it essentially by going on human nature. Human beings love to know what other people think. So when you say to them, would you like to know what other people think? Invariably people say yes, because we're all curious. Then tell me 3 things about you. What's your age range? What's your gender? And where do you live? And with those 3 elements, we can tell you that 60% are men visiting us and sharing their indexes, and 40% are women. Women in the audience, please, if you can help us with that, I would be grateful. If you're thinking about policy making for today and the future, you'd be rather interested to see that those who are participating most in this initiative are aged between 15 and 34 years old. That's today and tomorrow's generation. It's an online generation. Certainly, when you produce the index in native languages, as we saw in the case of German, you have a very strong increase in participation, indexes shared, and the age ranges increase. So more people over 55 and more people over 65 start participating. Let's take a little look at the findings. What are people coming up with? So this is the proportionate weight given by all of those who have shared their indexes with us worldwide. It's interesting. Take a look at where income, housing, and jobs come in, relative to the others. So if you're positing, do we need to go beyond GDP, then this would indicate that those material living conditions, whilst important, are not the most important things that people have on their minds. And I'm not denying the connection between the material and good education, but what I can tell you is the United States spends more on education than any other country and doesn't have the best education system. France spends more on health than any other country. Sorry, it's the other way around. France spends more on health per capita than any other country and doesn't have the best education. The United States, it's on health. So it's not about the money. And PISA shows this as well. If you send the best teachers to the worst schools, then you start improving. Civic engagement. Those of us involved in public policy making should be very concerned about that. Although it's schizophrenic because people involved in this, they are engaging civically. Where does life satisfaction come out? Top, interesting. Health, education, work-life balance, globally. This isn't a rich country concern or people who can afford to worry about this question. This is the case around the world. The issue of work-life balance is a really important one. Now let's take a look at Lithuania. It's only based on 128 indexes, so I wouldn't call this heavily statistically relevant. Health, education, coming in top, life satisfaction third. The environment is higher in your case, as is a sense of safety. housing seems to be of less concern to you. I thought you'd enjoy to see how you compare with your Baltic cousins. So take a look. The Estonians seem to be a little bit more concerned about housing, interestingly. And you look at the Latvians, for them, life satisfaction, work-life balance, they come out top. So it's interesting. It's interesting. You're starting to see something that's interesting. I'm not going to draw too many conclusions. I'll let you do that. We've also produced figures for the EU as a whole, which is, averages, but it doesn't cover. It does cover the EU 28. Apologies, because here it's the responses. We don't have data yet for certain countries in the index, but in terms of responses, anybody can come in and anybody can choose the weights. We only have data for 36 countries, but that's not bad going now because it's all comparable. So there you see we're at 6 million. Every single country in the world's visited us. That's interesting. It's a global phenomenon, not something that's just of worry for those who can afford. But this is hardcore. You can't get any more hardcore than the OECD's economic surveys. We are now incorporating well-being indicators and mapping of the performance of countries, and examples, recent examples, are our surveys of Austria and the United States. We just had Alexis Tsipras, the Greek Prime Minister, and his finance minister with us 2 weeks ago in order to work on structural reforms. And they are very interested in these sorts of issues. They're still in an EU process, a very complex EU-IMF process.
Into the hall just now, Taoiseach and I were asked to score the quality of life indicators on the wall. And this is a very tricky exercise for the leaders of two parties in a coalition government, particularly when the television cameras are on us. And the interesting thing is that we did actually give different scores to the different indicators, but we ended up with the same result. And that, I think, has to be the secret of a good coalition government. We want Ireland to be at the very top of your better life indices. And that means, in the first instance, planning a route to full employment. We are, of course, also conscious that we are doing all of this not just to meet economic objectives, that ultimately achieving these economic objectives is about building a better quality of life, ensuring that we have better living standards, and that our population enjoys better health, a better environment, and safer communities.
That was the Deputy Irish Prime Minister. This is the Irish Business Confederation wanting to position Ireland, among other measures, as top in the Better Life Index from the OECD as well. So I will leave you, lastly, with a little message in Lithuanian. I cannot pronounce it, but do join us in this exercise, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Anthony. Actually, you have at least 129 because I entered my results last night. I very much encourage everybody to do so because this is a very user-friendly initiative. And now, the last but not the least, I'm happy to present Ms. Signe Ratzo, who is the director of DG Trade for 8 years already, and previously, before joining European Commission, she was working at the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Communication in the Republic of Estonia. So, knowing perfectly the area of responsibility from the small open economy and on the global perspective, she agreed us to educate us on the new European trade and investment strategy. So where are we now and what we should expect?
Thanks a lot for your kind introduction. Differently from Anthony, I've been in Vilnius on several occasions. As being Estonian, that's quite natural. But it was a good occasion to come to your beautiful city once again. So thanks for the invitation. My perspective is a bit different. The focus is a bit different than the previous two presentations. So there will be the economic part, namely what is the contribution of trade to jobs and growth. so far we do not really measure the contribution of trade to well-being. But one of the indicators, I was just starting to think what could be the indicator. And actually, we also have the Eurobarometer surveys among the EU citizens. The latest one of those has come up quite recently, and there you really ask the question whether the EU citizens also think about internationalization, globalization, trade more specifically, and in the preparation of the new communication on trade, there will be a specific survey as well. So this could also give some good indication what the EU citizens think about open trade and investments and how those contribute to their lives. Now, in my presentation, first, I'd really focus on the role of trade investment as an engine for jobs and growth in the EU. Actually, there were some references also in the first presentation of Stefan, namely also showing the role of exports in the economic growth. Then the second question I'd like to ask and give you some examples is namely, is the EU trade policy delivering? Is it actually bringing what is expected? And also giving some practical examples on the basis of the EU-Korea FTA, which is one of the most recently concluded ones. And then more specifically looking into the future, into the communication, which will come up with this autumn. And there, I'd very much also appreciate your input. I will put a few questions on the table, and I hope that we will have time to, during the discussions round, to deal with those. But now also starting with the good news, which is namely that the EU continues to be the world's biggest trader. The largest exporter, importer, the largest source of FDI, and the largest investor. Here on this slide, you can see on the world map which of the countries and regions have either the EU, US, China, or Japan as their first trading partner. And as you can see that the world is predominantly blue, meaning that the number of countries and regions which have the EU as the first trading partner is the largest. Now, also in terms of jobs creation, trade is important. Across the EU, some 31 million jobs are supported by EU exports, which is around 14% of total employment. Before coming here, I also looked up the figures, particularly for Lithuania. And in case of Lithuania, the figure is 17.9%, which is more than the average for the EU. So 17.9% of the jobs in Lithuania are supported by the external exports, not taking into account the internal market. So if you also add on top of that the EU internal market, it's even higher. It might be of interest also to see what are the major markets which create the major export destinations, so to say, in EU external trade that create most of the jobs in Lithuania. Here, Russia comes first, creating, not surprisingly, I guess, creating 19% of the jobs. And then among the other major markets, the US comes second with 3%, together with Turkey. Then followed by China with 2%, and then 1% Canada, Japan, and South Korea. Exports, as said, are fundamental for jobs and growth. 1 billion in exports creates some 14,000 EU jobs. Certainly, in the world economy of value chains, it's not only exports that matter, but imports are equally important. They are also increasingly important to European jobs and growth. And actually, trade and investment liberalization is therefore a win-win situation. And actually, what the economic analysis has shown that opening up an economy to trade investment by 1% can actually lead to 0.6% growth in productivity, meaning that it will mean more productive jobs. Investment is equally important, both outward investments, which is a key component in the competitiveness strategy of many of EU companies, but also inward investment, which is a direct source of jobs. Foreign-owned companies employ some 7.3 million Europeans, and as said, on average, these jobs are more productive, more qualified, and better paid. And I guess that this is something that Lithuania, in the course of its EU accession and also in coping with the economic decline, has actually learned a positive lesson from the contribution of trade and investments in this respect. Now, if we look at how actually the EU is coping with as compared to its main competitors. Here on the graphs, you can see the comparisons of trade shares in global trade in merchandise and in services. And as you can see, the EU, which is the blue line, has maintained more or less its share in global trade. Certainly, if you exclude oil and gas, it's even better, because knowing that EU is really relying on imports of energy, whereas the US and Japan have very much lost their trade shares, and mainly to China. On the services, the EU is very clearly the world leader, followed by the US, and then Japan and China are coming with much smaller shares. However, certainly we have to be aware that in the years to come, most of the growth will be generated outside the EU. Some 90% of growth, and therefore, in order to be able to grow, also for the EU and the EU companies, we will need better access to the markets, and particularly to the markets which are rapidly growing. And this is where also the EU trade policy comes into play. Now, also showing you some figures which perhaps are not so well known. And also knowing that for Lithuania, for instance, manufacturing sector is still important. And here you can also clearly see that in manufacturing and services trade, there is a growing surplus for the EU, particularly after the economic decline. As we know, the year of 2009 was in global trade was really the year of the decline. But since then, the EU has even more regained in services and manufacturing trade, and has been able to increase in its surplus. As said, the fuels and minerals is a different case. Now, if you look at member states' performance, I'm not quite sure how well you can see, but there you can really see the divergent figures per member states. It's not illogical that those member states who joined the EU in 2009 and 6 and started from a relatively low level have been now the best in gaining more shares, both in world export markets as well as in the share of total exports. But for you, I think really the good news here is that Lithuania is leading here with more than 400% of growth in terms of the change in the share of the world export markets, but also if you take its share in total EU exports. Now, the next question, whether EU trade policy is delivering, whether it's actually bringing the benefits in terms of our GDP, in terms of growth. In recent years, we have concluded 2 landmark agreements in this respect with South Korea and with Canada, which have been more significant in terms of the growth benefits. Certainly, it's important also the agreements that we've had with Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia in the neighborhood. Also, if you look at the agreements which have been in place longer, like those with Chile and Mexico, those have also boosted EU exports as well as market shares. As you know, currently a series of beneficial agreements are under negotiation, which could potentially increase EU GDP by 2%, which is equal to the size of the economies like Austria or Denmark. And it's no wonder that the US will be the biggest, will provide the biggest contribution as the 2 economies together make up some half of world economy and 1/3 of world trade. But also the agreement with Japan, Mercosur, ASEAN countries will be important in this regard. With China, we are not negotiating free trade, but investment agreement. So in the future, there will be even more market access opportunities for European exporters. If we compare the situation in 2006, the EU trade, only 1/3 of EU trade was covered by FTAs. If we are able to conclude all the negotiations which are negotiating for the time being, then it will be some 66% of the total exports. Now, what are the lessons learned from trade agreements? And here I'd like to mention the case of Korea, which has been the most ambitious trade deal that has been ever implemented. What is important is that it's not only liberalized trade in terms of tariffs, but very much looked into the non-tariff areas, non-tariff barriers. And this is an important also lesson learned, having in mind that also the EU-US negotiations, the so-called TTIP, very much also concentrate on regulatory aspects on the NTBs. And what has been the experience so far from the agreement with Korea is that we have a living agreement in the sense that we are monitoring the implementation in different working groups, thematic groups, as there are sectoral annexes of this agreement for pharmaceuticals, for cars, for chemicals, for instance. And these enable us to remove the barriers even before they emerge. Namely, if we find out that there are some legislative procedures, some new developments which could create barriers for EU exports, we can deal with that already in this implementation framework. It also has been an economic success if we compare the exports to Korea before FTA and now after the implementation. The EU exports in general have increased by 35%, and EU has been able to replace its long-standing trade deficit with a surplus. Now, you can also have those who are interested in trade can also have a closer look on the paper, which is on our trade website and also gives more detailed figures on that. But knowing that for Lithuania, dairy sector is an important sector. For instance, in the dairy sector, the EU has been able to double its exports. And 99% of the tariffs will be eliminated as a result of the full implementation of the agreement, and also the different NTBs in the sanitary measures will be relieved, which would give additional opportunities also for the exporters on your side. Now, if we make the comparison with the US, who also has free trade agreement with Korea in place, then we can see that the EU has been much better in gaining market shares as compared to the US. Now, one of the indicators on the basis of which we can judge whether also the benefits of trade agreements have actually been gone to the economic operators is to see how much of the preference has been utilized by economic operators. And here also Lithuania can be satisfied with the results, as its companies are among those who are most active in using the preferences. The rate of preference utilization in Lithuania is more than 80%, and for the EU 28 is less than 70%. And if really you compare the trade figures, namely in the sectors which have already been fully liberalized and which have been growing much more rapidly than those where still there are tariffs in place. 46% of growth as compared to 9% of growth. Now, so much about this, the economic benefits and also the importance of trade implementation, where also the member states have an important role, making the case for their companies that the opportunities are there for them to be utilized, and making sure that the companies actually are aware and making use of that. Now coming to the communication, the autumn communication, certainly there are quite a few challenges that we are facing in the EU trade policy. If you continue, if we really want to continue to deliver with our trade policy, we also have to take into consideration that there are a number of issues affecting trade which are increasing. They are becoming increasingly complex. Certainly when we are discussing and negotiating regulatory systems, the non-tariff barriers, it's much more complex to negotiate, but it's much more complex also to monitor and implement. So the question really is, how can we deliver the agreements that meet the needs of all the stakeholders? Also, how can we make businesses aware of the opportunities that are available for them? Now, the second question, and this is also very much connected with the debate that we currently have on TTIP, with the negotiations with the US, is namely the how to deal with the trust of the citizens. That first, that they know what are the benefits for them, and how also make sure that they trust the negotiation process itself. Those who follow the US negotiations are aware that these are the most transparent negotiations we have so far. If you look at all the documents that you can see and download from our website, starting from the EU positions up to the legal text, even the comments on the legal text, how to read them and how to understand them, these are all there in order to facilitate all those who are interested in the negotiations really know what is going on, what is at stake there. Plus the whole process that we have as part of the negotiations, the meetings with the civil society, with the representatives of different stakeholders, and so on and so forth. But certainly this is the way to go, and it would be also interesting for me to get some feedback from the audience here, whether you really have seen the change, whether you still think that something can be done more and better in this regard. Then the very important questions, how to respond to the shifts of power in the global economy. If you also follow the previous presentations today, it's certainly a very valid question, namely how to deal with the strategic partners, how to engage with big emerging economies like China, but also how can we encourage them actually to be more supportive of open rule-based trading system. Even those who are members of the WTO not always respect the rules of the WTO. It's not, I guess, it's not for me to remind you who of those WTO members are. I guess you know well. Certainly, these will be certainly some of the aspects that we would like to deal with in the communication. How to deliver results through the World Trade Organization. For the EU, it's very important that the WTO stays relevant, not only from economic but also from systemic point of view, because it is a multilateral institution, but also now having in mind that the EU is negotiating so many regional bilateral agreements, the US is negotiating. The question will also be how the new trading opportunities that have been created through those bilateral but also plurilateral negotiations can be broadened to all WTO members. How to also include the commitments into the WTO rulebook. When it comes, for instance, the issues of energy, the issues of access to raw materials. These are also some of the issues that have been mentioned by Lithuanian authorities here as the relevant also for your country. And last but not least, how to promote our values through the trade policy, namely the promotion of human rights, sustainable development, labor standards are core to the EU's image. And trade policy could also be a good tool to promote those, just as other external policies. Here, for instance, the issue, how can I do more to encourage responsible supply chains, having in mind the Bangladesh, what has happened there, and now the textile compact as a result. You may know that now the EU has the Commission has a proposal on conflict minerals, which is now discussed in the Council and the European Parliament, whether there are additional areas that can be covered. So these are all relevant issues for discussion. I'm just leaving this slide on the screen, which I hope will also will give you some food for thought, and hopefully will also make you react along these lines. And certainly, if you have any questions concerning our negotiations, I will certainly be also most willing to respond to those. Thanks.
Thank you very much, and we will proceed to discussion at this point. First of all, I would like to give word to Professor Kuth. He would like to make a short remark. Please make it short, because we are still running out of the schedule. Thank you.
Okay, I try to make it as short as possible. Some comments from my side. Well, first of all, just to prevent misunderstandings. Serious economists have never been cheerleaders for growth or for maximizing GDP. Growth is the outcome typically of a free market system where people can accumulate capital, can engage in the division of labor, and can be creative, and then the outcome is growth. But no one, as far as I know, none of the serious economists would ever say we must maximize growth. This is nonsense, right? Second, I think there's very little that the Stiglitz Commission has really delivered that was new to their debate. One can say every 30 years there's a debate on GDP. And people deplore, oh, it is not measuring well-being correctly. Well, it was never meant to be, and then there's a big, campaign about it, but it was not new. Nothing of what this commission delivered was really new. And then I was a little bit disappointed, saying that well-being is so complex that it cannot be measured in a single number. I agree. But then in the next step to say, and here's the Better Life Index, and there's no correlation with GDP, ergo GDP is not a good measurement for well-being, is not very convincing, actually. A word on inequality. If we assume a global perspective, inequality is decreasing, thanks to the development of, capitalism in the emerging economies. So if we really assume a global economy, a global perspective, if we do not care where people come from, all we can say is, from a global perspective, inequality in terms of income is decreasing. Second comment on inequality. If we say that GDP is a very poor measurement for well-being, and at the same time we take income levels, which are derived from GDP, from national accounting, to say that inequality is increasing, then this is inconsistent. We should then show well-being, is the distribution of well-being increasing or decreasing, but not of income levels. Third, you correctly stated that people are living in families, they are not living as pure individuals. Therefore, what is typically done when it comes to inequality measurement, you are not measuring what the individual income is, but what the household consumption possibilities are. But then take these results seriously. Just an example from my own country, 90% of the increase in income inequality is due to a different household composition. We have more single households, and it is more costly to live in a single household than in a four-member family. And this explains practically all the whole increase in inequality. Are people worse off? No, they're not. They have more choices, and they've obviously chosen rather to live on their own, to raise their children as alone, rather than stay in maybe in a marriage that they don't like, whatever. Yeah, this is a free choice. So we should be very, very cautious to say whenever income inequality is increasing, actually for a couple of years now it is decreasing, at least in Europe. We should also mention this and not confuse the driving forces and the outcome. Finally, it's always easy to bash forecasters. Just let me make the statements. The key recipients of forecasting are the governments, because they're interested in their tax base. You cannot tax well-being, you can only tax income streams, and therefore it is important. And please look into our forecasts. There's a huge story around the numbers with all the risk scenarios that we are telling. And just saying, well, the sharp numbers do not always materialize is not showing that the forecasts that are presented are consumed accordingly. Very last comment on your presentation, which I'm extremely pro-free trade, as you can imagine, but please do not convey the impression that trade creates growth. This is not the case. It makes people more productive because we're engaging in more sophisticated division of labor processes. And this is an extremely important argument. But trade per se does not create jobs. If just for a thought experiment we close all our borders, do not trade with the rest of the world, then of course we could, after a readjustment, have full employment at a lower income level, of course. But whether we have full employment or not depends on labor market regulation, not on having free trade or not. And therefore, saying that, that a trade surplus with Korea shows economic success. This is mercantilistic thinking. Whether trade is favorable or not cannot be judged by the trade surplus with another trading partner.
It's quite a success to have opponents sitting at the same table. Maybe, Anthony, you can remark to the statements of Dr. Kutz?
No, I think we shouldn't keep our audience waiting any longer, because I don't know how productive it is going to be to start sort of, having a tennis match here, which I think would last quite a long time. I don't know how interested, but I'd be a lot more interested in giving people a chance. Because I saw one or two hands pop up while I was talking, and I didn't take questions then.
Yes, please.
Yes, my question is of a technical nature. I saw, Professor Guc, that you included life satisfaction index among all others. I thought that life satisfaction is a summing up index, which should stand separately or sum up rather than be next to the housing or other indices.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, because what you're actually seeking to do is try to identify. You can interpret, if you're, for example, a user going onto the index, you could interpret it as a sort of a collection of the rest. The fact that you are incorporating it in its own right, and if you are interested, you click and you go inside, see the definitions that are provided, see where the data is coming from, you're able to then grasp the distinction that is being made there, where what you're looking at is how satisfied you are with your life at a given moment, and if you're projecting that over time, the prospects for that to be of a sustainable nature, how high you consider them to be. That is as distinct, if you like, from the elements of quality of life that relate directly to the quality of your environment, the quality of your water, your air, etc. So, we know this is the case, that there are many contexts within which people have elements which are objectively measurable that can be of a relatively positive nature, and yet the life satisfaction elements do not necessarily follow or correlate. But one of the things that I would say is that we're very humble, in the sense that what I was saying was deliberately, I was being provocative to ourselves as well, because we're the past masters at producing economic forecasting, and we've been doing it for a very long time. So what we're looking now is embarking on something that is relatively complex, because what hasn't happened to date is that people haven't really taken the step to actually stick their heads above the parapet in order to actually begin a more concrete policy discussion regarding what is, if you like, what are the ultimate purposes that we are working towards. Not an easy thing to do. It's a lot easier to do, for example, in organizations where you are covering the gamut of public policy. And so within the OECD environment, you will have people who will reduce everything down naturally to the area that they focus on. For example, I used to work in international trade. I found your presentation very interesting indeed, because at the time the tendency was to reduce things down to, it's all about trade. It was trade and, you remember. But in the OECD, my colleagues on tax are very convinced that really it's all about tax policy at the end of the day. My colleagues working on macroeconomics will be looking at saying, well, actually, it's really all about what we have. That's a tendency of academic disciplines. Part of the reason that we've got ourselves into the mess that we've got ourselves into is because there's a lack of cross-fertilization among disciplines. So I was talking to the director of LSE recently, London School of Economics, and political science. They forget that bit. About the need to actually cross-fertilize a lot more between disciplines and activities and environments. So economics as a discipline is going through a lot of transformation right now, and that's very salutary. But it also within the disciplines, behavioral economics, which has become a lot more prominent, but also the connections between those disciplines, because nobody has the ultimate answer, and they're all sort of making it out to be that way. It's very complex. It's extremely complex. One of the things I think that what we're looking to do is to try and narrow the gap between what's good politics, and I'm sorry that one or two of the MPs may have left us, and what's good policy. Because we can talk in theory, and economists can even talk about the fact that they may not be particularly interested in achieving certain rates of growth. But let's not delude ourselves. A lot of what has led us to the crisis was certain promises and expectations for growth in different environments. And those promises and expectations for growth drive many things. You need certain things in order for other things to occur. So what we're positing is that we've done a lot of things. It's our challenge to try and learn from many of the things that we've done in the past as well, and cast forward into the future. So elements, for example, like subjective well-being, at the antipodes. I'm originally a historian, and I'm not a professor, but thank you. I think if we look back in 100 years, if we're all still around, we'll be looking at stuff like this and saying, okay, this was very much baby steps, very imperfect indeed. But what you're starting to see is it's actually starting to happen. You're also starting to see that people are becoming really interested in it. And that's where you have a potential to move. Perfect? Absolutely not. Improvable? Totally. Transformable? Possibly, why not? But get on and, let's get on and explore it.
We'll take 3 questions at the moment and then divide them. Okay. Yes, please.
Hello, Marius Vashega, European Commission. The question I would like to ask is mainly to Stefan, and it's about the macroeconomic imbalance procedure, which you mentioned with certain criticism. The macroeconomic imbalance procedure is of course a part of a wider economic governance framework which has been created during the economic crisis as a tool to fight that crisis and to end that crisis. And there are more things, the draft budgets, coordination of draft budgets, country-specific recommendations on structural reforms and similar things. And in February this year, the analytical note has been put forward by the President Juncker, Commission President Juncker, to actually think again whether the framework which we have is enough, whether we should make it stronger or maybe somewhat different. So I would like to hear a little bit more on your take. How do you see not only the macroeconomic imbalances procedure, but the wider framework of economic governance which exists now in the EU? What's your take on that? Thank you.
Now, Mr. Vilnius, please.
Hi, I'm representing now the Employers Confederation, but previously worked for the government for 2 years, so I knew a little bit of the inside of it. But my question is to the Mr. Gush from OECD, as a citizen, since you are trying to serve the citizens more than the governments, how do you see the political governance quality as part of your measurement and indicator system? Because there is lots of political science and political psychology, and all of it is together, as you mentioned. The cross sections disciplines go together. So the quality of the governance in the countries is a key thing, I think, for the longer-term sustainable and balanced growth, and also the well-being of people. And how do you see that? Do you measure? Do you intend to measure? And what's your think of that?
Any third questions at the moment? Okay, maybe Stefan, you can answer then.
All right, so on the MIP, my suggestion would be to keep it as focused as possible and not to overburden it with lots of other policy targets. And as far as policy coordination is concerned, we should not forget that competition, also competition in the policy-making field, is extremely important. It's not only to prevent people from committing errors, it's also for giving them latitude to explore new things. Who knows what the best regulatory framework is if we do not give people the possibility to do it, as long as they are accountable for what they are doing. And the risk is that people no longer feel accountable, say, well, this comes all from the European level. We here on the national level cannot influence very much. You observe the same behavior also within your own countries when regional parliaments or regional policy makers say, well, I cannot influence a lot, this comes all from the national level. So we must make sure that the European community stays, or the architecture stays bottom up and not top down. Peer reviewing is extremely useful to learn from each other. And I think there the European Commission can play a very productive role, disseminating others what are good examples. But at the end of the day, it's all about ownership, right? If the policymakers in the country are not convinced that the policies that are recommended by them from European Commission representatives or from the Council, then this will not change anything in the country. You may think of the new Greek government whatever you want, but one thing seems to me for sure, there is no consensus between what the European partners expect them to do and what they are convinced they should do in the very best interest of their country. Whether they're right or wrong isn't of importance here. What is important is, do they want to put this into action or not? And clearly, they have a completely different view of what is good for Greece than the rest of Europe has. And therefore, it is very doubtful that the whole approach works. Ownership matters. I think the OECD can confirm this. We can give support, technical support, recommendations, best practice, etc. But if people who are responsible towards their voters and not towards the European Commission or whoever else do not share the same conviction, then there's very little we can do. And again, this puts the limit to the way we can coordinate economic policy making in the European Union, because the consensus on what is good and what is bad policy making is not very broad. If I may add this, we are so happy that the Baltic countries, we as Germans are so happy that the Baltic countries are now fully part of the Euro area, because we feel that they share much more of our views on theories, on good policy making, than, for example, our neighbor in the West.
Well, we're happy about that too, but no pain, no gain, you know.
Well, I'm too tempted, I'm afraid, to pick up a little bit on this, because I don't see things as a German, as a Brit, as a Spaniard. I used to work for the European Commission with the public interest of the EU at heart. I now have the privilege of working for the OECD with a lot of global interests at heart. And I have a memory. The first memory is when you create a currency and when you have economic and monetary union and you decide not to create a fire escape, the fire escape was tax harmonization. And the country that vetoed that in 1990 was the United Kingdom, number one. And it wasn't going to form part of the currency union. The other countries that, in a sense, went along with that have a certain co-responsibility as well. Secondly, a stability pact was put in place in 2003 and 2004. Who flouted it first? France and Germany. And then people conveniently forget certain things. Where has most of the bailout money gone? Not to the Greek people. It's gone to private banks, and we know in which countries. So I think the first rule is honesty. Fronting up and telling your own people, your own electorates, your own constituents, some of those harsh facts. And it was interesting to hear Stefan on the issues around currency and the fact that if you devalue, at the end of the day, you're going to have problems. Indeed. Well, how strong has the debate been in certain countries regarding the devaluation impact for exports of the creation of the euro in certain countries? ... Germany. So in all of this, if you just look at your belly button, you're not going to go very far. If you look at the situations in your country and in other countries and where they were 5, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, etc., then you can start making progress. I'm going to give you a little microcosmic example. Spain. Spain is the most European crisis you can possibly imagine. It was around a property boom. Who were the principal lenders for that property boom? French, German, British, Spanish banks. Who were the main sellers of property? UK real estate agents. Who were the main buyers of property? Every single nationality under the sun you can imagine, just go to the Spanish coast and see. Oh, that's a Spanish problem, is it? So who are we kidding? But I think one of the really important things we need in all of this is honesty. And that starts with discussions and debates like this. Because it's very easy to cast aspersions and say, oh, just look at the people over on the other side of the fence. Come on, none of us are perfect. None of us have done perfect things. And, you know, you make mistakes, etc. Yes, but the idea is that you learn from them as well. But I do feel quite strongly about these things, so I think it's important that we keep them in mind. Because if you don't have that honesty, you're not going to get very far. And if you just sort of fall back on things. And you have a duty also in public spaces to make sure that people whose daily job isn't to necessarily remember all of these things, you know, they're getting on with their lives. But you're forming opinions. If you're in the media, you're forming opinions. If you're in politics, you're forming opinions. If you're an academic, you're forming opinions. If you're at the OECD, you're forming opinions. You're forming opinions, and people will form opinions on the basis of what you are saying and what you are doing. It's a heavy responsibility. And a lot of people are playing with that right now. And I think that is something that people should think 2, 3, 4, 5 times about before going down that track. But, okay, apologies for that. The question, which is a very good one, regarding the issue of the sort of the governance and the quality of governance. I think this is a view that is now really quite widespread in the OECD context, is that we began with a financial markets crisis. That financial markets crisis very quickly spread into the real economy and super quickly spread into becoming a social crisis. And so the impact that we have and that people have now, I don't think it has been actually people's choice for 55% of people in Spain, young people, to be unemployed. I don't think that is a question of choice. And in times past, those Spanish people migrated north and worked in car factories in Germany. Now it's only the top level people who can migrate north to Germany. So those who are at the bottom end of the value chain, say in a country like Spain, who have less education, who don't speak languages, etc., they don't have so many places to go. And that is a challenge. I think it's a challenge also within the European context. And then when we take it back and see what people are attaching most importance to, education comes up. And education is a public good, and it needs to be financed publicly. And where is the finance going to come from if countries do not have any money to be able to invest in turning that stuff around? But we go from that economic and social to a crisis of political systems. We're very proud of the fact that we are all democracies in the European Union, and it's something to be justifiably proud of. Now that we are all democracies in the OECD, back in the 1960s when the organization was created, you didn't have to be a democracy to join. In order to be in it and to join now, that is one of the criteria. The problem we have is that democratic systems are quite deficient. Again, let's all be honest. You know, we know that as human beings, influence is part of our lives. For centuries, it's always been that way, and therefore the influence of interests. But have things gone too far, where we've got certain interests that have a capacity to capture systems? They capture regulatory systems. They lobby. Who gets in to see the people making those decisions? Do we have transparent records of the number of times that people have met at the European Commission, the British government, at the OECD, etc.? All of this stuff is fundamental. Are people getting a sort of a fair go in terms of the issues that they're setting out? So this question of governance that you raise, I think, is a very important one, because I think what we are realizing through this crisis as well is that the difficulties and challenges that we have are far greater than we really ever thought. I think that it's allowed us to discover how imperfect the world that we're in is, and probably because we had very high standards. So discovering that degrees of inequality, and here I have to diverge with Stefan, and I'll give him the elements that we've got of proof for it, divergences in income inequality, in access. When we think inequalities in the Better Life Index, it's not just about income. It's also about access to education, and it's about access to health, and it's about access for women relative to men, and it's about access for young people and old people. So inequalities, they cut across the board in terms of what we're talking about, and it's very fundamental. But all of these elements are critical if you're going to engender trust. Now, what I'm painting is a slightly problematic picture, but I think that if we front up to it and accept that there are some very serious deficiencies, that's the start of the solution. If you make out that there's no problem of inequality, you know, we turn it around this way, we turn it around that way, fine. It's like, I mean, the number of people who spent, how long was it, on climate change? Saying, oh, the science, oh no. Well, now, guess what? We don't have a lot of time. That's the worrying thing. We don't actually have a lot of time. And I don't really know where we are on that. We're spending a great deal of energy and time on it. For example, the OECD is doing a lot of analysis on fossil fuels. And thank God the price of oil goes through the floor, because now governments can take away the subsidies. And there's not going to be an impact, you see, because that's the political bit. You know, if you take away the subsidies on fossil fuels, the price of petrol will go up. They won't vote for me. Oh, dear. So I won't do it. Okay. Price of oil gone down, magic. Take away the fossil fuel subsidies now. That's going to be critical. And then you can start moving things forward. You don't imagine that the politics aren't there. They are there. But we've got to somehow close the gap between good politics and good policy, and recognize that there are areas where those can be improved. And those governance processes are pretty important in that respect. To its credit, I mean, and I think I have a lot of time for the European institutions, probably inherently, but also having worked inside them and observed them. Imperfections, definitely. But if we didn't have that level, we would be far worse off individually. Probably if we hadn't had the euro at certain times, then the impact on national countries and their fragility would have been extremely considerable. And now we face big challenges around the eurozone because managing a currency of that nature, with all of the different cycles that we're in as well. You know, what's good for Germany at a certain point, it may not be so good for another country in the eurozone at a certain point. So the constitutional balanced budget decision taken in Germany is a laudable one. But if the constitutional balanced budget decision taken in Germany at a time when there are massive imbalances within the eurozone where you share currencies with others, and you are therefore, you know, not doing your bit and somebody else is doing their bit, you can't imbalance if everyone's doing that. Yeah? They don't need a PhD for that.
We still have a couple of minutes. Maybe we can take a final question from the audience. I actually realized that there were many aspects touched today, but there were one common thing in every speaker that mentioned, that was lack of trust. So maybe you can shortly comment, so how can we restore trust? Because the trust seems to be a core stone for the moment. Just very shortly.
Well, restoring trust is the premises for restoring trust is that you bring together accountability with competencies. As long as there's an easy way out that you can blame someone else for your own errors in policy making, trust will not be re-emerge. Plus, of course, rules of the game must be respected. This is extremely important. Otherwise, you are creating a policy regime risk. People no longer know, people who are, for example, expected to take investment decisions, if their whole regulatory framework is unclear, if it is unclear whether rules are only written on a piece of paper or whether they are imposed, or whether they are imposed in the same way in all member countries, then you are destroying trust. And just sticking to the rules is an elementary factor for recovery.
Trade policy is a bit peculiar in the respect that is the EU, or to be more exact, the European Commission, who is negotiating on behalf of all the EU member states because of the exclusive competence on trade and now also in investments. Just to give you an example from the investment side, which, as far as it was the member state competence, and the member states negotiated also investment protection agreements, which also since 1960s. And actually the EU has negotiated, the EU member states have negotiated 1,400 of this kind of agreements, which is more than half of all these agreements that have been negotiated on the world scale. And as far as it was the member state competence, there was no problem with that. There was no problem with the specific issue which has now has come to the front, namely the investor-state dispute settlement. But now that it is the EU competence, now that the EU is negotiating with the US, all of a sudden this has created a problem. Now one may question what is the real issue there. But certainly how we approach to the issue is that in the first place there is much more interest among the wider public in trade negotiations, which we've seen now with the US negotiations. What is our reply is really to be more transparent, to be really accountable to the people of what they are doing, that we are taking into account their concerns, their worries, having in place the consultation system and really being more transparent. This is the way that we intend to go very clearly also in the future.
Yeah, I banged on a lot about trust a little bit earlier. So one thing I wasn't able to pick up on earlier is I do think a lot of strides have been made in the field, for example, of trade policy in connecting it up with maybe quality of life now, but certainly very important issues if people are to understand the value of and the benefits of international trade, rather than as a mantra to say, I believe free trade is good. I think a lot of the work that's been done in order to be able to address issues around environment, social conditions, health, very complex issues, because you're talking about collective preferences very often that diverge in different parts of the world. And I do think that it's a very interesting macrocosm, not microcosm, but macrocosm of the capacity that you can derive at a certain time to reconcile differences cultural, political differences and achieve some good results. I think, for example, that the steps that have been taken in recent years in terms of transparency have been very important, fundamental, and probably timeframes for negotiations should be extended accordingly, because in order to bring people along on complicated issues like investor-state dispute settlement, to bring trust in those spaces for citizens is complicated. One final point I'd like to make is on tax. I said earlier on that you reduce everything down to tax. I mean, I think that's an area where we've made some really concrete progress in the last few years, where I think a lot of citizens could look around and say, okay, we have to pay tax. Is everybody paying tax, and is everybody paying their fair share? This is important for governments, it's important for deficits, it's important for the rules that Stefan was saying are so important. Work on automatic exchange of information, closing down tax havens. Everybody was at it before the crisis. Everybody was at it. We came up with the rules to put an end to it back in the late 1990s, but it wasn't deemed to be appropriate to move forward. And then the worm turns, the crisis comes along. And it's great, because I think it's an area where people can see really concrete, significant progress. 40 billion euros have accrued to OECD member countries since the tax standards on tax havens and automatic exchange of information were put in place. And now we're moving into an area which is an interesting one, because rules sometimes are actually wrong for a certain moment. Human beings make rules. They make rules at certain times. The tax rules that were made for the 20th century do not apply in the 21st century in a globalized economy where, for example, 40% of the value of a BMW car is software. And a company can argue that that intangible value can be positioned anywhere they choose for tax purposes. But yet, they sell that car and make the profit on that car in a particular country, say Lithuania. And yet, if they consistently position the intangibles, intellectual property, marketing, branding, software, all of those aspects in low-tax jurisdictions, you're creating serious imbalances. So what we've had to do there is adjust the rules, because the rules are not adapted to today's world. So you've actually got to adjust them. Obviously, that's going to mean that you're going to run into the odd vested interest that may have an issue around that. But it does go back then to this question of citizens being rather important, because if you lose their trust, over a long period of time, I think that the consequences of that are rather worrying. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank our guests for valuable contributions and their expertise. I also would like to thank European Commission and European Parliament for their hospitality and express our sincere appreciation for interpreters and all the staff who actually, for this excellent organization and excellent work during the conference. The conference now is over, however, you will still have a chance to prolong your discussions during the lunch. Lunch is served just around the corner in Novotel Hotel on the first floor. Just take your stairs from the ground floor. You will see the directions. Thank you very much and have a nice day.